Right now, you're at flood planning and mitigation for affordable housing organizations. And if you want to join the conversation for our session today, it's hashtag CAHC 2022 on Twitter. And if you're not following us already, our handle is at PSC Housing. So before we jump in, I'd like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, the La Rosa Building Group, and the Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. I think the slides are having some issues, so you could just go to the next one, Carlene, it's no problem. And then our collaborating sponsors, Bank of America, Harvard Foundation for Public Giving, KeyBank, Webster Bank, Rockport Mortgage. Our list of supporting sponsors who have helped to make this conference possible. And last but not least, the session sponsor for the sponsor, Connecticut Green Bank. And again, we're so happy to be doing this conference for the third year in a row, and we wouldn't be able to do it without all of our wonderful sponsors. So thank you. Also want to announce that our housing data profiles for 2022 have been released. I will drop a link in the chat shortly for those of you to take a look at those. You can access the latest housing data for all of Connecticut's towns and cities in an online interactive format. So look out for that link and check out your town. And before I pass it over, I'm just going to do a couple housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded and we will make all recordings available following the event. All participants have entered muted and we ask that you remain on mute unless you've been asked to unmute by one of the presenters. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen and send that to either me or Carlene Sharmalis, who I forgot to introduce at the beginning, who is assisting me today. Your speakers will let you know how they want questions to be sent. And I believe they're going to save some time at the end of the session to answer some of those questions. And after the session is completed, if you want to provide some feedback to us, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can do so by clicking the megaphone icon in the lobby and provide feedback that way. For that, I will turn it over to Kelly to start our presentation.
Thank you. So today, welcome to our session. And today's session features an insurance, risk management, and research professional. So as mentioned, I'm Kelly McGowan, and I'm the lead research analyst at the Public and Affordable Housing Research Corporation. And I'm joined by Lynn Chrissy, who's the Assistant Director of Product Development at HAI Group, and Mary Ciccoloni, who manages the risk control and consulting team at HAI Group. So today's session is going to begin with a brief overview of the insurance industry regarding flood risk and exposure from Lynn. And then I'm going to share the latest research on the exposure of the affordable housing stock to flood risk. And afterwards, we're going to hear from Mary, who will share strategies affordable housing providers can pursue to develop a preparedness plan and mitigate against flood risk. And then we're going to take it back to Lynn, who's going to share FEMA's new Risk Rating 2.0 program and describe considerations your organization could make before building to reduce your flood premium if you need coverage. And then we're going to close with a Q&A. But as we're presenting, please feel free to enter questions in the chat and we'll try to answer them throughout the session. And if we don't have time, we'll answer them at the end. So take it off, Lynn.
Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. What you're looking at, this is the 2021 US $1 billion weather and climate disasters. Why do we talk about this in conjunction with flood? This is really the first year where flooding showed up as its own icon, but what's in a label is important here because as you look at hail, hurricane, tornado, severe weather, in most cases, the damage that came out of these really had very little to do with the initial label that you see. It had everything to do with the subsequent flood damage. So if you go to the next slide, why does this get the insurance industry so concerned about this? $1 billion means that our reinsurers, and those are the insurance companies who insure insurance companies, it gets them involved. It's that level of financial impact. And if you look at this chart, and these are our disasters from 1980 to 2022, these are those $1 billion disasters. Take a look at the last 10 years. We've seen significant increase in both severity and in frequency of these kinds of disasters. It's not just these disasters, though, and as we look at the next slide, why are we talking flood? Because of the way rainfall and precipitation has changed in the United States. Again, this is a historic view, Southwest drought, not a big surprise, but look at the increases that we're seeing in all other parts of the country. It's not just increases, it's also how the rain is being delivered. What we have found is that particularly over the past 10 years, it's not rain that falls in a consistent way across the year or across seasons. Instead, what we're seeing is an increase in what we'll call microburst storms, short duration, lots of rainfall in a very short period of time. And so as you go to the next slide, you realize that how this manifests is that these flooding events that are resulting from these kinds of changes have now caused more than 1/3 of the natural catastrophe-related fatalities. And we now realize, and this is from Swiss Re, one of our reinsurance research partners, that flood is now by far the most frequently occurring of all natural disasters. And what I think you'll see in the coming years is that flood will become the label that will drive most of our disaster planning and maps. And let's take a look at what this means and how it impacts. There's 3 things, and these are the things that are going to be driving how flood impacts you and your territories. The first, of course, is climate, and we've been talking about that. The second is what I'll call exposure levels. That has to do with how has the land itself been altered? What have we done to make it more livable, more arable, roads, storm drains, large irrigation projects? And the last is vulnerability of exposed elements. And this is what's really driving a lot of our concern as an industry. Think of it as soil sealing. There's an increased urbanization. People are moving into city areas, and asphalt is covering the soil. So cities become more reliant on the infrastructure in place that's there designed to carry water off. But most of that infrastructure, whether it's storm drains, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, they were built 50, 60 years ago. They were engineered for a time when microbursts were not this most frequent type of rainfall delivery. And as a result, these things are coming together to create flood. So what does this mean for you? I'm going to turn this over to Kelly and talk a little bit more about the direct impact.
Thanks, Lynn. So as the frequency and impacts of severe weather events have been climbing, we wanted to better understand their potential impact on residents of affordable housing. And our findings are covered in our recent report, Taking Stock, Natural Hazards and Federally Assisted Housing. So in this report, Park and the National Low Income Housing Coalition partnered to examine the location of federally assisted rental properties in relation to 18 different natural hazards. And today I'm just going to be focusing on flood risk. But if you're interested in learning about the exposure of affordable housing to other risks, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, and earthquakes, I encourage you to check out our report. So prior research suggests that rental housing experiences greater damage and recovers more slowly from disasters compared to owner-occupied housing. And this is because multifamily and duplex structures recover more slowly in general. Renters and landlords have fewer incentives to invest in mitigation features, and they're less likely to receive federal disaster funds. And lower cost rental housing in particular is even more vulnerable to the effects of disaster. And this is because it is often older, it can be in poorer condition due to federal disinvestment, and it can be located in more risk-prone areas. And these properties also operate on smaller margins and have less access to federal disaster recovery resources, as I mentioned earlier. And this can make it harder for the owners of these properties to invest in mitigations and repairs. Additionally, these properties tend to house more vulnerable resident populations, many of which have fewer resources to evacuate, further compounding these challenges. And evidence from past natural disasters really demonstrate that low-income households and people of color are hit hardest by severe weather events and experience higher long-term displacement rates. And these trends likely arise because of investments in mitigation and preparedness strategies are often lower in communities of color. People of color are also more likely to live in older, segregated, and disaster-prone areas and have less economic, social, and cultural capital to prepare for and respond to disasters. So this really demonstrates that it's important not only to consider building mitigation strategies for affordable housing properties, but ensuring that these strategies are targeted towards the most vulnerable populations as well. So with that background kind of framing our research, we matched the affordable properties in the National Housing Preservation Database against measures for flood risk from FEMA and NOAA. And as an aside, I encourage you to check out the National Housing Preservation Database if you're interested in learning about the affordable housing stock in the communities you serve. It's a nationwide deduplicated database of federally assisted rental properties. And we use this to match against FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer map and FEMA's new National Risk Index and NOAA's National Storm Surge Hazard maps. And when we did this, we found that 11% of federally assisted homes in Connecticut are located in census tracts with moderate to very high risk of negative consequences from riverine flooding specifically. And FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer indicates slightly fewer federally assisted homes at risk of a major flood than the NRI. And we found that overall about 3,000 federally assisted homes in Connecticut are located in a 100-year floodplain and could have a 1% annual chance of experiencing a flood. And an additional 2,000 homes are located in a 500-year floodplain, which are areas with a 0.2% annual chance of a flood. And we also found that 5% of federally assisted homes in Connecticut are located in a storm surge zone for a Category 2 hurricane. And as Lynn mentioned, flood risk is rapidly growing. And with that, the maps and data that we use to assess flood risk don't always keep up with the impact of climate change and can underestimate flood risk as a result. And this is confirmed by a recent analysis done by First Street Foundation, which found that the number of properties at substantial risk of flooding was 1.7 times the number of properties in FEMA's 100-year floodplains. So this really suggests that more in-depth consideration of flood risk beyond the National Flood Hazard Layer may be needed when assessing potential flood risks and using this to inform siting efforts, and also recommending mitigations for these properties as well. But if you're looking, these maps can still be a great first place to start to assess flood risk because they're so readily available, and then kind of using that to build a strategy to dig deeper. So all of the maps accompanying our report can be found in our Taking Stock mapping tool, and it includes layers to assess to assess the exposure to wildfire, earthquake, tornado, and flood risk, and it includes statewide comparisons of the number of assisted units in particularly high risk areas. And as I mentioned, these tools are really just a great first step to help you understand the level of flood risk. However, they do not necessarily replace an individualized flood risk assessment. And just because a property is in a low risk area doesn't mean that it could never experience a flood, especially as the impacts of climate change are rising. And affordable housing providers can use these tools to identify properties and populations most at risk, to update their disaster mitigation and preparedness operation plans. You can also use it to evaluate evaluate the natural hazards that prospective development sites and to inform where and how new homes are built to reduce risk. It can also be used to collect data for grant applications, to look at properties where additional large-scale studies to identify mitigations might be needed, assess insurance needs, and to make the case for the inclusion of affordable housing in community-wide preparedness and mitigation plans. So as I mentioned, there's the disparities between the disaster funds being allocated to communities of color and affordable properties. So it's really important to demonstrate that many of these properties are in need of the investment in these mitigation features, and looking at this data can be a way to make that case. Other flood risk data sources you can use to assess flood risk include First Street Foundation's risk factors map, which considers a location's risk of flooding from high intensity rainfall, overflowing rivers and streams, high tides, and coastal storm surge. And the National Hurricane Center's storm surge map also describes potential storm surge zones for hurricanes of varying intensity were to hit your area. And there's a number of resources that you can leverage to boost the resiliency of the properties in your portfolio or the community to protect against flood risk. So the Ready to Respond Business Continuity Toolkit includes resources for developing disaster plans and protecting buildings, residents, and businesses. Planning considerations for disaster housing provides resources for jurisdictions to improve their disaster plans. The Ready to Respond strategies for multifamily building resilience list strategies that housing providers can implement to make multifamily buildings more resilient to severe weather. And finally, the disaster resiliency and recovery resources include strategies and resources for rural communities seeking disaster resiliency and recovery assistance. So now I'm going to pass it off to Mary, who's going to share some tips to help your organization develop a disaster preparedness plan and mitigate against flood risk.
All right, so Kelly, you can actually just jump right into the next slide, just due to the sake of time. So first thing I just wanted to talk about is making a disaster plan. So when you're assessing your disaster risk, you'll want to first identify the hazards that can impact your organization. And this really needs to be done with a holistic approach to address the many types of disasters that the housing industry is exposed to. These can be natural, accidental, or man-made disasters. Keep in mind, especially with natural disasters, there aren't necessarily specific, they aren't specific to certain geographical areas anymore. So for example, we're seeing severe cold weather in areas that historically haven't experienced those temperatures. So it's important to really account for everything. Regardless of the type of disaster, you want to focus on examining the impacts that it could have on your organization and identifying the critical and essential functions of your business. So you'll have a plan for how you'll continue to deliver those functions during a disaster. And just remember that government disaster aid will likely have reduced capacity during high-level disasters and resources may be limited. You can go to the next slide, Kelly. You want to consider the impacts that this will have on the populations we serve. So we're all in the housing industry and your residents will likely be severely impacted by disasters, especially flood. Also keep in mind, back to what Kelly was saying, many may not have the resources to really weather these storms. So it's important to have a plan for how you will continue to operate your business if your office space is compromised in any way and no longer accessible. I think the ability to work from home has certainly proved to be a potential solution to that problem, but also consider what you would do during, a widespread power outage when those working and living in that surrounding area won't have the ability to work from home. Another important piece of disaster planning is having a communication plan. Your agency may be approached by news outlets and media, and if you do decide to speak to the press, it really should be done by someone that has media training. There are some insurance carriers out there that offer crisis communication services, so this is something to certainly take advantage of if it's available to you. Also, making sure that you're identifying resources and partnerships during your planning phase. This can include emergency contacts, as well as having a list of contractors on hand for recovery services. Again, it's important to have this outlined beforehand so you aren't scrambling to find a contractor in the middle of a disaster. Kelly, if you can go to the next slide, we're going to switch gears and talk about building codes. So building codes have and will continue to play a major role in creating resilient communities. Not only are casualties reduced as well as property damage, but they also help communities get back on their feet faster by minimizing some of the indirect losses like business interruption and lost income. So the overall purpose of building codes is to establish minimum requirements to protect life safety and reduce property damage. They are updated every 3 years by the International Code Council, who FEMA does have an ongoing partnership with, and a lot of the updates come from lessons learned post-disaster. The codes are not enforced on a federal level. They are intended for states and local jurisdictions to use as the model basis for their own building codes. So in order for these to be effective, the states need to actually adopt the codes and amend them to address their local needs. Currently, most states do adopt the codes at the state level. However, it's not always enforced at the local level, which then allows jurisdictions to make those decisions. And then some states and local jurisdictions can also amend and modify their codes to either higher or lower standards. So really, this all results in a wide range of adoption and enforcement practices. Generally speaking, a jurisdiction is considered hazard resistant if it uses the most recent additions of the codes without weakening any of the provisions. You can go to the next slide, Kelly. FEMA published a study in 2020 on the effectiveness of building codes, and it proved that modern building codes lead to a major reduction in property losses from natural disasters. They examined buildings in all 50 states, focusing on flooding, hurricane winds, and earthquakes. And they found that about half avoided losses, totaling $1.6 billion annually, because they were constructed following stringent building codes. Specific to flood, there was an annual savings of $484 million. So the darker green color that you're seeing, that's the higher amounts of loss that was avoided. You'll see the higher values along coastal areas, but there's also some areas throughout the interior of the country in that upper Midwest. And this was linked to code enhancements after the 2008 Midwest floods. So while flood hazards are prevalent across the country, those areas in that darker green color have been more proactive in reducing their losses. And there's a big opportunity for the savings to increase because 65% of jurisdictions across the country have not yet adopted modern codes. Next slide, Kelly. A big piece of that and the reasoning behind that usually just comes down to costs. Building code contributes about 2% extra in overall construction costs, but it is worth the investment in the long run. There was another study conducted in 2019 by the National Institute of Building Sciences, and it found that constructing a building to the standards of the most recent version of the code, which at the time was the 2018 version, that resulted in a benefit of $11 saved for every dollar invested. But again, still, despite this clear return on investment, only 35% of communities across the country have adopted modern building codes. The more widespread adoption of codes would also be expected to generate federal savings because less recovery spending would be required after disasters, and those savings can then be reinvested into future mitigation. You can go to the next slide, Kelly. Speaking on that, earlier this year, FEMA announced their initiative to really prioritize and enhance building codes across the country. They have numerous different funding programs, but one I wanted to specifically mention is the BRIC program. And this provides funding to address high-level future natural disaster risks. It's not just specific to flood, it's any natural disaster. And it essentially shifts the funds away from reactive disaster spending and instead towards proactive investment in community resilience. So through this program, FEMA will invest in a wide range of mitigation activities, including community-wide infrastructure projects. Eligible applicants are local governments, state agencies, and federally recognized tribal nations. So affordable housing organizations can work with their local governments and have them apply on their behalf. For this year, the application opened on September 30th, and it's going to close January 27th, 2023. The next slide, this chart shows the spread of applications for the first year the program was implemented. And as you can see, a large majority were actually for flood control measures. One of the applications selected this year was for a housing development in a high flood risk area, which was impacted during Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And the goal of their project was to improve a local seawall to protect that community. I wanted to point out that FEMA is prioritizing delivering at least 40% of the overall benefits to disadvantaged communities. So while the BRIC program may provide support for kind of larger scale community projects, there is clearly an opportunity for the affordable housing community to join in. And you can go to the next slide. I wanted to end my piece of the session with just some more practical tips for property owners or developers. There are some key measures to consider during the planning phase of new construction to improve your flood resilience. Of course, the most effective means of protection is going to be to avoid building in areas that are prone to flooding in the first place. However, that may not always be possible. And as we're seeing, there's certainly the risk of flood outside of those defined flood zones. It's important that you're always working with reputable contractors, architects, engineers, those that understand the code requirements for your local area. Also remembering that it's almost always going to be more expensive to bring a building up to code after it's already built. When you are building, you want to make sure that the lowest occupied floor is above the base flood elevation. And then if the building does have any underground areas, that those definitely would want to be waterproofed. Make sure that there is adequate and proper drainage at the site. So your contractor should be considering, how the flood water is going to discharge onto the roads, the relation with municipal drainage systems, and then also having backflow prevention. Also consider barriers that will protect the site. So this can be, a well-designed levee or boundary walls that flood water would first encounter. You also want to examine how the site will be accessed and if there are additional access roads, and ideally those would be elevated so you can get to that site before the floodwater has fully drained. And then also take a look at the critical infrastructure in the surrounding area that the site is dependent on and how that would be impacted by the flood risk. So this can be things like bridges or power stations. We saw recently with Hurricane Ian in Florida that the causeway connecting a barrier island to the mainland was severely damaged, leaving no way for vehicles to access that island. So you do want to make sure that you're exploring those external factors as well. So those are just some of the things that you would want to consider with new construction. Again, as I mentioned, it's really key to work with reputable contractors who will essentially cover these bases for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lynn, and she is going to speak on the insurance side of this.
So let's talk a little bit, and this is going to be kind of a wrap up, because as Mary was mentioning and Kelly, the infrastructure bill is now going to start finding ways to incent communities to step up to build resiliency. And Risk Rating 2.0, which is replacing National Flood Insurance Program, that's a part of this overall plan. The whole tone of this has changed. It's no longer affordable insurance for people in flood zones. It is now actuarially sound flood insurance being made available with little regard to affordability. And for those of you who have new business that you've placed with NFIP since October of last year, 2021, or renewals that were starting in April of 2022, you are probably seeing the impact of this. So if you go to the next slide, the maps that Kelly was talking about, our traditional flood maps, they're still there, but think of them as being tools now for helping communities decide on infrastructure programs. When it comes to that individual address that you're looking to develop, you're going to find the rules have changed, the factors have changed. Flood rating is now down to an individual address level. They're going to look at a variety of factors that were never part of the equation before. Foundations, the height of the lowest floor, including what equipment is there. They're going to bring in your building replacement cost. Doesn't mean you're going to get that limit, just that they're using the full replacement cost to figure out as a calculation for how much. Frequency event modeling is still there, but distance to water has also now expanded. It's not just rivers and oceans. It now includes vernal pools, storm drains, and other potential sources of water, and figuring out whether your address is going to be prone to flood. There are some other significant changes that have happened, Kelly, if we move to the next slide. And these are things that are going to indeed tend to increase premium. There used to be a preferred risk policy program. That's gone. That's been eliminated, as have all the grandfathered risks done. There's also now a new 4 or more flood event rule. This doesn't mean that you owned it or even the prior owner owned it at the time. Historically, if that address has had 4 or more flood claims or events, National Flood Insurance Program is going to refuse to offer coverage, which means you're going to find yourselves looking to the excess and surplus lines market, hoping to get flood coverage if it's required. There are no caps on premium increases. Now remember, we're still in the process of rolling through renewals. This is a government program, but so far constituents have not pushed back in a way that has prompted our legislators to put premium caps in place. So what you're going to see is what you're going to get. And the only discounts now available will be for deductibles. If you're willing to take on more of the risk, then you will see a slight decrease in premium. So as developers, what do? Let's take a look. First of all, don't wait for closing to get your flood disclosure. Consider getting your flood disclosure at the time your surveys are done. Ask the owner to reach out, and in our resources, we've given you the tool to go to FEMA to get the flood history on that property. Do it immediately. Know what you're getting into. And before you build, consider your geography. Are there vernal pools? Are there other potential sources? Is something that you're going to do potentially change the water profile of that property? As Mary said, don't wait for the building codes to get changed. Use the national building code standard. Do it at the beginning if you're doing new build. I think that with the political change we've just seen, or the continuation, that FEMA risk index and some of the other FEMA programs, they're going to continue putting pressure on the states to adopt that standard building code. Don't wait for it. And of course, consider your local infrastructure. How old are the storm drains? How old is that water treatment? Where is the runoff? And are there any plans to get a hold of some of the brick money to make the water flow better? Because you may not have been in the flood zone, but that doesn't mean that the address that you're looking at may not still need flood insurance. So that's what we have for today. Are there any questions?
Thanks, everyone. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and we will also be sharing a link to some of the common questions that we've received when we presented some of this material on a webinar earlier this year. And then I'll also share some links to some of the material that we shared, such as FEMA's National Risk Index, for y'all to access. So here are some of the data that we referenced in the presentation. So I encourage you to check that out if you're looking to assess flood risk among in your community or among some of the properties that you serve. And then here are some of the toolkits that we shared during the presentation about building business continuity and strategies for multifamily building resilience. And then one of the comments that Lynn made about flood disclosure, in some cases, the laws about flood disclosure vary by state. So you can learn more about that here in this link. And then a guide for how to request a property's flood history loss as well. So I hope that these materials are helpful if you're looking to assess potential flood risk and develop a preparedness plan in your community and among the properties you serve. And then finally, here are the common questions that we received when we organized this session at a webinar last month. Such as kind of cover potential funding sources to invest in mitigation and resiliency projects in it beyond kind of the BRIC program, how to request a property's flood history, and then other considerations and changes that FEMA's risk rating 2.0 methodology might mean for your organization. So one question that came in from Carol, what are some improvements for existing multifamily structures? So do you want to take that one, Mary?
One of the things I would definitely do for existing is start kind of in the basement of your building, look at where your mechanicals are. Definitely try and get those elevated if possible, you know, especially with some of like your electrical components. You'll have to, of course, work with an electrician, but that can be a good first step. You know, I think the money it's going to take to invest in that is going to be worth it in the long run. Electrical damage, you know, damage to your HVAC, that can be very, very costly. And even just a little bit of water can really damage that a lot. So I would kind of make that your first step. And then also just making sure that you have someone on your team that's kind of monitoring any of these types of disasters, any heavy rainfall, and just taking, you know, those proactive steps just to secure the building, you know, just diverting the water away, making sure your gutters are cleared, especially now at the end of fall, all the leaves have fallen, you know, make sure that you're clearing those out, kind of just easy steps like that.
I would also add I encourage you to check out Enterprise Community Partner Strategies for Building Multifamily Resilience Toolkit. I linked to it in the chat, but the guide really lists a bunch of examples that affordable housing providers implemented to basically repair and respond to some of the damage that occurred in response to Hurricane Sandy, and they include pictures and costs. So this can be a really great place to learn from your peers about strategies that can be implemented kind of after a property is already built to mitigate from these risks retroactively. Another question is, what about slab on grade construction? So looking about the specific materials of the property that could impact the potential flood risk.
I would just go back to getting that elevation above that base flood risk. That's really what I'm going to go back to. Any of your, you know, mechanical components really should be raised above that. Again, kind of what I'll echo what Lynn mentioned too. I know this question was for existing buildings, but even if the code doesn't require at the time of construction, it's a good idea to do it anyway, because eventually that will be the code that your, you know, neighborhood is adopting. So that would just be my suggestion for that, is to really start there.
Any other questions or comments that Lynn or Mary want to make in addition to kind of some of the points that you covered in your presentation?
I'm just going to say that, you know, the time to consider flood is not, you know, as you're closing the sale. You really need to move that up to the front when you're doing your initial surveys. Use it as one of the characteristics that you look at in your elimination between 2 or 3 possibles. The cost of flood insurance is not going to come down. It's only going to rise.
And I would also add that if you're looking to kind of where you can go to learn more how to recover after a disaster or tracking the potential impacts of past disasters, the National Low Income Housing Coalition leads the Disaster Housing and Recovery Coalition, and they provide a lot of really great materials and kind of track the impacts of these disasters, and can be a great place to kind of mobilize to encourage the promotion of vulnerable populations as part of the recovery efforts. So I think that kind of covers everything. We really appreciate all of the great questions that you all had and the expertise from our panelists to learn about kind of changes in flood insurance, exposure of flood risk to affordable housing properties, and how folks can mitigate against these risks, and some potential funding sources. So I encourage you to check out some of the links that we've provided in the chat, as well as from our presentation. But if you have any questions, I encourage you to follow up with our emails listed here. Thanks, everyone.